So it's been Happy Birthday Winston this week. The 150th anniversary of Winston Churchill's birth, 30th November 1874, has just passed. And to mark it, David Reynolds and I recorded 10 episodes looking at Churchill through his relationships with 10 contemporaries who shaped his character and career. In this concluding episode, we'll discuss our key takeaways from the series and ask what picture of Churchill emerges, and also respond to some listeners who've sent in questions. So, standing back, for me, I think perhaps the first rather unexpected thing that struck me through the series was just how volatile and excitable Churchill was in his interactions with Lloyd George, Chamberlain, his wife Clemmy in particular. Today, we've become accustomed to dramas that portray him as a kind of stoical bulldog figure. He can be irascible at times, but very determined nevertheless. My sense from the conversations with you, David, is how emotional he could be and how much he could change his views and shift his positions.
Yes, well, for me, talking about this with you and also reflecting on the book I wrote, Mirrors of Greatness, strengthened my feeling that the famous picture photograph of Churchill by Karsh of Ottawa, with his jaw jutting out, defiant, that image of Churchill needs a little bit of amendment. Yes, the sense of robustness is right, the rock-like character, but I think it's also misleading because, as you say, this is a man who's also so volatile, particularly in his early life, so full of energy, very sensitive in certain respects to the changing political mood, and in a way that's not unreasonable because any politician, if he or she wants to get things done, has got to work out what features of the political context can be changed and what you've got to live with. And Churchill, I think, develops a skill of improvisation, which is something that isn't entirely captured by that bulldog image.
What also struck me early in the series was how much Churchill pushed himself forward, and that perhaps the key to unlocking why he did that was that he thought he would have a short life like his father. We had a message from a listener, actually, who hadn't heard that before and asked us to unpack it a bit more.
All right.
Did Churchill really fear he might die young, and that then drove him to find glory fast?
Yes, I think there was a real imperative about that early part of his career. He made a remarkable impact in those first few years as a sort of war hero, traveling around, rushing around the world, and then translating the fame into influence in the House of Commons in the early 1900s. He thinks he'll probably only get a few years, maybe into his 40s, to make his mark. And the mark, in his view, has to be emphasized by writing about what he's done. What matters is words as well as deeds. That double whammy, if you like, is absolutely essential. Churchill's got no religious faith in an afterlife, and so he feels you've got to make the most of this life. And he's sure, as he says in 1938, that words are the only things that last forever. And also, I think that because he has so many upheavals in his life, that volatility you talked about, it's almost as if he has to keep on remaking himself, even after he realizes he's not going to pop it in his 40s. So, being thrown out of government because of Gallipoli, or being pushed into the wilderness in the 1930s, he's got to rebuild himself again and again. So self-creation is almost a life's mission, in many ways right through to the end, because, of course, he's devastated by being kicked out, which is his phrase, kicked out by the British electorate in 1945 at the end of this amazing period as War Prime Minister. And he feels, I think, that, in his gut, I've got to create my reputation all over again. I've got to fight back. I can't take my finest hour for granted.
The other thing I'd like to touch on is where this drive for greatness might have come from. Does it come from a trauma in his background with the difficult relationship with his father, in his father's early death? To get a little bit psychoanalytical, perhaps, is there a wounded ego there, with Churchill compensating, overachieving, and then burning out on occasions with his famous depression, his black dog?
Yeah, well, I think that term black dog is very much comes from Lord Moran, Churchill's doctor. The motif that Moran found in his diaries, and he published them in the 1960s, was that there were recurrent periods of depression and so on. Well, Churchill was clearly a man of moods. If there was action, he was usually upbeat. If there wasn't action, if things weren't going well, he could feel very sorry for himself. You know, it's almost a question of adrenaline bursts. It's not dissimilar to the experience of most people in life, certainly A-type personalities. So I don't know whether there's a simple psychoanalytical answer for this. That's not my field. But what I'd say on a pragmatic level, I think, is that this helps to explain why he doesn't try to relax by slumping into a deck chair, say. Instead, he throws himself into some equally absorbing pursuit. Painting famously after Gallipoli, or bricklaying. I mean, that's a methodical, careful thing. He has to think about it and so on, deeply concentrational. And that's the kind of thing he needs to do. As for the father, Lord Randolph, well, clearly the whole question of the father bugs him. And we talked in the beginning about the dream story, that memory of his father coming back to Winston vividly in 1947 in his studio in Chartwell when he's copying a painting of Lord Randolph. And I think it is a fascinating story because it's, in one way or another, his father looking over his shoulder and still saying, come on, what did you actually do? It's almost like, you know, reprise of those damning school reports that Lord Randolph was so complaining about when Churchill was a boy. But in another way, you could almost say that because Winston never has a chance in that dream story to tell his father, it's almost as if, almost deliberately, he knows he's eclipsed Lord Randolph and he doesn't need to tell the man just how much the son has dwarfed the father. So it's a fascinating story to try to interpret. But what you can say, I think, is, as Violet Asquith, his old friend, said, this preoccupation with his lost father, worshipping at the altar of his unknown father, is a constant throughout Winston's life.
And it's clear all the way through the series, I think, that Churchill has an eye on his reputation, his brand, if you like. In Churchill's Forgotten Years, the documentary we made in 2005 about the last 20 years of his life, we refer to his famous comment that history will be kind to him because he's the one who's going to write it. He's absolutely clear about this from a really early age, isn't he? That even in the 1890s, fresh out of Sandhurst, he's determined to write up his own exploits around the empire, to burnish his own record.
Yes, he has that sense of ambition and that almost unique sense of himself. We're all worms, he says, but I believe I'm a glowworm. And he recognizes that worms need words in order to glow. And he's the one that's going to add those words that are going to be lustrous, if you like. It's very striking how many of the phrases that he minted and used over the years are ones we still live with today. Special relationship, parley at the summit. These are phrases that still shape discourse of international relations. And in the book titles of his World War II memoirs, although not all those book titles originated from Churchill, he made them his own. The Gathering Storm, Their Finest Hour, Triumph and Tragedy about 1945, and so on. These still capture our basic understanding, at least in Britain, of the dynamics of World War II.
When it comes to words, we had a comment about our episode Rival from historian Andrew David Stedman, who's a specialist on Neville Chamberlain's diplomacy and author of Alternatives to Appeasement. You said that Churchill's famous parliamentary eulogy of Chamberlain was an example of Churchill not kicking a man when he was down. Andrew wrote in, "This is a popular claim and the eulogy is classic Churchill, beautifully worded, but I always think it's undermined by the famous aside, according to his lights, which I always find patronising and rather unnecessary when he's supposed to be being magnanimous about his former enemy. Churchill then does indeed kick a man when he's down in The Gathering Storm. Much of his criticism of the Chamberlain period is justified here, but as David Reynolds has demonstrated in his earlier work, much of it is rather unfair with deliberate omissions, indeed questionable history at times. Otherwise, excellent stuff, he writes.
Well, as Andrew says, according to his lights is, if you like, a cutting aside. In other words, that Chamberlain behaved honourably according to his lights, implying very strongly that Churchill's view of the world was very different. It's also true that, as I went through at great length in the book called In Command of History, when I was looking at how Churchill wrote his memoirs, there was a lot of selectivity in the way Churchill picked and mixed. But I would still say that Churchill's valedictory for Chamberlain was generous. In fact, he really pulled a lot of punches. There were other things he could have said. So, for example, with the Czech crisis of September 1938, leading to Chamberlain's famous conference at Munich, that's the third of 3 flights across to Germany to talk with the Führer face to face. Churchill is really opposed to the way Chamberlain's running after Hitler, rather than, as he felt, standing tough and calling the Führer's bluff. And a week after the Munich settlement, he denounces the agreement in the Commons as a total and unmitigated defeat. Now, he mentions that in his book, but he never used it in his valedictory for Chamberlain in 1940 when Chamberlain died. And as he observed in The Gathering Storm, which is volume 1 of his war memoirs, if Britain had to fight a war, it would have been far better to do that for the defence and independence of Czechoslovakia, which was the most industrialized state in Eastern Europe. I mean, it had the best army as well. Instead, Chamberlain finally drew a line in the spring of 1939 over Poland, for which Britain could do nothing. And it's also striking that Chamberlain's hasty commitment to Polish independence became an albatross around Winston's neck when he was Prime Minister, an albatross around his neck in his wartime relations with Uncle Joe Stalin. So I would say that Mr. Churchill, if you like, had plenty of very valid reasons for not cherishing the memory of Mr. Chamberlain, but he didn't mention them when he gave that speech after Chamberlain's death.
The other thing that I became more aware of through our series was how Churchill's words marshalled his ideas, if you like, how he used key speeches and speech-making to really think through issues and policies, that he was a public intellectual, as you put it. And behind the scenes, he worked extraordinarily hard on those. This was not so much inspiration as perspiration.
Yes, those speeches take us back to a completely different era of political communication from the days of tweets and social media, an era when speeches in the House of Commons were reported at length next day in the newspapers. Indeed, they were often printed, parts of them printed verbatim. And Churchill is very conscious of this. In his early days, he used to send the speech which he'd prepared around to the press so that it would come out in the next morning's newspaper. He would do that the night before. So he's really preparing this stuff. And also in his speeches, there's a real commitment to the speeches as a form of public communication, particularly when he's Prime Minister in the Second World War. So, for example, when Hitler invades Russia, Churchill calls this the fourth climactic moment of the war. And then he goes through for people the previous 3, the story so far, if you like. But then he tells them why this one matters, why we have to support the Russians, whatever we think of their ideology, whatever I've thought of their ideology in the past, because otherwise Hitler will turn back on Britain if he defeats Russia, turn back and try and finish off the job. So here's a man who really thinks about words and speeches as a means of communication. So this idea that we remember Churchill because he's brilliantly good at sound bites has missed something absolutely fundamental. He's someone who understands intellectual argument, and also in the war, he takes the British people into his confidence, and that's what people appreciate and really remember.
Alongside that, I suppose his other great superpower is his sheer energy. I know that sometimes that's a double-edged sword. He gets a lot done and he can collaborate well with colleagues at points. But clearly he's a very tricky colleague to deal with for them.
Yeah.
Very excitable. And people like Lloyd George, Chamberlain and Attlee, found him really quite difficult to work with.
Yeah, I mean, most of the people who worked with him comment on this. The tremendous sense of buzz you got from Churchill, positive or negative, often both at the same time. He said of Joseph Chamberlain, the father of Neville, the politician of the late 19th century, that in his prime, Joe Chamberlain made the weather. Well, Churchill certainly made the weather, the political weather in his own time, because the storms, the turbulence, the commentary were very much dictated by him. He made the news. And some people were put off by this. So it's interesting, if you take Lord Halifax in the darkest days of 1940, Halifax has got a bad press, and he's certainly the sort of villain of the piece in that famous Churchill film, Darkest Hour. But why Halifax gets so fed up with Winston is not just about the policy arguments, questions of whether and how we can fight on. It's also just a clash of temperament. Every time Winston is in the cabinet room in late May, early June, he seems to be giving great dramatic orations as if he's in the Commons. And Halifax writes in his diary, "It does drive me to despair when he works himself up into a passion or emotion when he ought to be making his brain think and reason." So this excitability is something that's a positive and a negative throughout his life. It turns people on, it turns people off. But the great thing about that whole career, if we take it in the full, is that in 1940, it's clear that the man and the moment come together. Whatever Halifax felt in the cabinet rooms, this is a point at which the British people need that kind of heroics. And Whitehall needs a new injection of energy. The civil service needs a leader who demands literally action this day. Get off your backsides. Get on with it. Give me the information I need. And that sense of energy in 1940 is enormously important and I think truly infectious. And of course, on the big issue of May, June 1940, Churchill was right and Halifax was wrong. Even to hint to Mussolini, which is what Halifax was suggesting, that Britain might be interested to know what could be Hitler's peace terms, that would have been disastrous. Any peace feelers would soon leak out with devastating effect on morale at home and abroad. So Churchill's argument, I think, was absolutely right. Far better to call Hitler's bluff, particularly once you got an army back from Dunkirk, and see if the country could resist bombing and possible invasion. On that, he's absolutely right.
We talk obviously a lot about the positive impacts of Churchill's character and career in our series. There are some areas where we might feel less comfortable with him. He clearly hangs on to empire, his secular religion, as Andrew Roberts called it. There's his attitude to women having the vote, his evident glee for war in 1914. I found that quite chilling. We've had a comment in from an anonymous listener saying they've enjoyed the series but feel we are sometimes too positive. They want to know what you don't like about Churchill. What are your criticisms of him?
Well, I would put it maybe in this way. Churchill is almost a victim of our tendency now to think of him as an icon, to put him on a pedestal, if you like. The consequence of that, the flip side, is that as some of his attributes become more questionable in a different age, so there's this feeling, well, we need to take him down off the pedestal. And that's why deliberately we've talked about some leaders, international leaders, who he would not have thought of as great, but in our own time seem to show marks of greatness. Gandhi, for instance, the half-naked fakir, as Churchill put it, who understood the power, I would say he understood the power of impotence in a way that defied the ethos of Sandhurst Military Academy. And Churchill had no answer to that philosophy of passive resistance. So for me, as a person, as a historian, I think we need to separate Churchill as a political figure from a lot of his attitudes about the world and Britain's place in it. So what I take away positively is that tremendous energy, that ability to use words, the sense of how he could look ahead while drawing on the past. And these are skills that I think any real leader needs. But much of the mental baggage that's there is not something for which I feel any admiration in the 21st century. That includes his attitude to women and women's place in society and politics, which is simply unacceptable, I feel, in the 21st century. And also his belief that most of the non-white races are clearly not capable, in his view, of running their own country. Again, that is completely abhorrent to me. Where I part company with Churchill, this man of tremendous and admirable energy, is over his idea that Britain and the world should basically be run by white males.
Yeah. In our episode about Gandhi, we talked about Churchill's racism, particularly his generalising of a whole religious ethnic group, the Hindus, as being corrupt and effeminate. Terry from Edinburgh has written in to ask more about that. She writes that Churchill's belief that empire was bringing natives from savagery to civilization, this sense of moral imperative behind empire, was a well-known racist trope to justify economic exploitation through the empire, and that Churchill's favouring of Muslims and Sikhs as martial races was a divide and rule tactic that the British Empire often employed across different parts of the empire, favouring groups useful to British interests. So she sees Churchill's position, I suppose, as cynical. Did Churchill ever rethink race and empire later in his life? Did he recant at all? And did Gandhi ever comment specifically on Churchill's imperial mindset?
Well, over the years, Gandhi made various overtures to Churchill. But the only time they actually met, I believe, was in 1906, very early on in their careers, when Churchill was a junior minister at the Colonial Office, and the issue was as much to do with attitudes to Indians within the British Empire in South Africa and Southern Africa and Eastern Africa. Gandhi doesn't ever condemn Churchill, and some of his letters to Churchill are phrased as "dear friend." But there's no real response from Churchill. And certainly Churchill doesn't at any point, as far as I know, recant. In fact, on the contrary, as he gets in the Second World War, he digs in. So that word fakir, half-naked fakir, F-A-K-I-R, is very astute. Because if you listen to it, it was a speech to his constituents in Epping, in Essex. If you listen to the word fakir, it very easily slides into faker, F-A-K-E-R. And that's basically how Churchill saw Gandhi, as an unscrupulous, very dangerous con man. Now, that was very different from many British politicians. They saw Gandhi as a very skillful tactician, but they also recognized his principal commitment to passive resistance. And that's why I found it so instructive to set Churchill alongside Clement Attlee. Because it's often said of Churchill, well, you know, he was a Victorian. That's how they thought in the Victorian age. Well, Attlee's also a Victorian, born in the 19th century, and like Churchill, a patriot. He fights for his country in the Great War, as Churchill does. But Attlee's a socialist, and that's an ideology that Churchill totally abhorred. And Attlee is also a politician who believes profoundly that India could and should follow other parts of the British imperial world, such as Australia, New Zealand, along the road first to dominion status within the British Empire and then full independence. That's what they did. And for Attlee, who's Churchill's successor as Prime Minister from 45 to 51, one of his proudest achievements was to make it possible, facilitate the transition from empire to Commonwealth. And that included Indian independence, admittedly ending up in a bloody way because of the partition between India and Pakistan, dreadful death toll, but still it happened. And for Attlee, moving from empire to Commonwealth was something that was a great achievement, something that Churchill simply could not accept. So Attlee is a Victorian, a very different Victorian from Winston, and someone whose worldview was closer to that of the 21st century.
I suppose the other negative theme that comes through in our series is the personal cost of Churchill's success in public life. His private life was tricky. A stormy relationship with his wife Clemmy, the overshadowing of his children. There's a cost in his self-absorption that was borne by the whole family.
Yeah, I think one of the very poignant parts of the Churchill family story is Clementine and the children. Clemmy devotes a vast amount of her very considerable energies and skill to him and his career. She says soon after he's married, Winston is going to be my life's work, and it was. And it takes a huge amount out of her. And when he's away, she needs to get away and recover, recharge her batteries and so on. Neither Winston nor Clementine were really sufficiently engaged, at least from a 21st century viewpoint, with the upbringing of their early children, Diana, Randolph and Sarah. It's only in the 1930s that Clementine really got involved with her youngest child, Mary. Mary is the one who becomes Mary Soames and later takes on the task of writing her mother's biography with great success. It's a fascinating book. So that constant fixation with his own career is a given, and it's only occasionally punctuated by moments when he does spend time with the children, but in ways that are almost schoolboy-like. He just has fun with them. They love it, playing games and all the rest of it. But he doesn't spend an awful lot of time thinking through, talking through their development, their problems, and so on. And in the case of Randolph, the son, it's hugely debilitating because what he's trying to do for his son, Randolph, is what he thinks his father should have done for him, which is to pay a lot of attention, to encourage the boy and all the rest of it, to be positive. But what he's doing is doing this positive support in ways that create in Randolph a huge sense of arrogance and self-centeredness. And that proves to be absolutely disastrous for the man. When the boy grows up into a young man, it really damages him. So I would say that Churchill's greatness in political terms came at considerable personal costs for those around him. On the other hand, they were hugely proud of him as a father. And of course, the luster of his own career added light to themselves, to their own significance and so on. So they benefit as well. But I would say that the benefits, as with many things about Churchill, are slightly mixed.
Linda from Bedford, in Britain, I think, rather than Massachusetts, asks how we chose the 10 contemporaries and who would have been number 11 and number 12 in a longer series or book. Lord Beaverbrook, she says. George VI. Why no room for Stanley Baldwin?
Well, in the podcast and in the book Mirrors of Greatness, I was looking at leaders who shaped him. So these are political leaders. So Beaverbrook, though an influential friend and crony of his, is not a national leader. Clementine is included, although she's not a political leader, but I felt that first, Churchill could not have done what he did throughout his career without her from the time they got married in 1908. She was absolutely indispensable. And yet, although there's so many times where you feel he's really just behaving like a male chauvinist pig and taking her for granted, their relationship was two-way. And being married to him enabled her to play political roles in both wars that she couldn't have done otherwise, and really brought out her leadership talents. And that's particularly true of the Aid to Russia program in 1941 to 45. So there are reasons for adding her in, even if she isn't a national political leader. Because, as I said, it gets us to concepts of greatness which fit our views now more than they did to Winston's. Who else? The 11th, well, probably would have been, I think, young Christian Smuts of South Africa. Winston's defeated opponent in the Boer War, but then later on as South Africa's premier in World War II. Smuts was somebody who really shared Winston's global strategic vision, and I think he was the only Commonwealth leader for whom Churchill had much respect. So Smuts might have gone in. Stanley Baldwin? Well, I would say they're definitely not. Prime Minister, yes, but Churchill held Baldwin responsible for Britain's failure to start rearmament in the early 1930s. He blamed Baldwin for that more than Chamberlain, who later on was carrying on, if you like, what Baldwin had started. And what happened, in Churchill's view, is that because we didn't start rearmament in the early 30s, this gave Nazi Germany a fatal lead that we had to struggle to catch up on. And it's very striking that in 1947, when he was asked to send a tribute to Baldwin on Baldwin's 80th birthday, he refused to do so. And he wrote, "I wish Stanley Baldwin no ill, but it would have been much better if he had never lived." Bang.
Wow, that's pretty cutting. Drawing things together in our approach of trying to seek Churchill through the perspective of his contemporaries, two people we discussed who I think really got him in different ways were Roosevelt and Stalin. Mm-hmm. Roosevelt, it seems to me, could see Churchill's romantic attachment to empire, how steeped he was in Victorian era imperialism, the kind of things we've been talking just now around Gandhi.
Yeah.
And Stalin was astute, it seems to me, about his character, perhaps using Churchill's volatility against him in negotiations.
Yeah, well, Roosevelt has this firm sense of Winston as categorically a Victorian, and for Roosevelt to say a Victorian is dismissive. And it captures the feeling that, if you like, the sun was setting on the British Empire and it was rising on an American century that was now dawning. But Roosevelt also understands that this is a relationship that matters to both countries in the circumstances of the Second World War. And the point is that relationships can change people and can change their views. So Churchill certainly gets engaged in this relationship with Roosevelt. He sees Roosevelt as the key person in what Churchill almost spins out now as a notion of a special relationship between Britain and the US in the circumstances, the desperate circumstances Britain's in after the fall of France. And Roosevelt plays on Churchill's imagination, probably consciously, but certainly very powerfully. Churchill sees this man up close and personal in a way that most of the world's public never does. He realizes the deep secret of Roosevelt, that this is actually a paraplegic who cannot walk unaided, for whom being pulled out of bed every day, being dressed, is a huge personal business. It's humiliating because he can't do any of this for himself in a way that we take for granted every day in our ordinary lives. Yet, this paraplegic is a leader who can inspire his own people and does so in the Depression and across the world during the war. Roosevelt comes over and he is a man of real personal courage. And courage is something that always matters to Churchill in terms of human relationships. Men of courage, usually soldiers who fought valiantly on a battlefield, but Roosevelt shows courage of a completely different sort. And that's why Churchill could say at times in the 1940s, when he's thinking about Roosevelt, I really loved that man. Now, Stalin, it's quite different. Stalin doesn't understand Churchill, I think, and Churchill doesn't understand Stalin. They're coming from totally different worlds. Churchill never changes his hatred of Bolshevism, but he convinces himself in August 1942, after that first set of meetings in the Kremlin, that he can build a personal relationship with the Soviet leader, a relationship that will counteract the dark Bolshevik militaristic forces in the Kremlin. That's his conviction, his conceit, if you like. He is the man to do it. Stalin is happy to indulge this passion Churchill has for personal diplomacy. He's flying around the world to meet the other two leaders, and he encourages the PM's faith in him, Stalin, even though Stalin has no trust in this capitalist imperialist. So Churchill, hope against hope, believes that he can shift a relationship, shift it against the political ideologies of the time. Stalin, I think, does not have anything like that faith. On the other hand, I think there are times during the war where he recognizes that he's got to get on with Roosevelt and Churchill. So relationships matter for him as well. So these are two leaders who are the ones I think are most significant for Churchill, the ones that he has to reach out to in the circumstances of 1940 to 42 after France has gone down the tubes in a few weeks. And part of his gift is not just defiance at home in the island of Britain, the island fortress, if you like, but also saying, where can we find new allies after the fall of France? And then working, improvising those diplomatic relationships. And Churchill's diplomatic improvisations, I think, are a remarkable feat and one that hasn't been sufficiently appreciated.
Finally, if there's one of these contemporaries who's most similar in character to Churchill, would you say it was de Gaulle? You do wonder what might have happened if the boot had been on the other foot, if you like, if Britain had fallen and France stood alone in 1940. If Churchill had been dependent on de Gaulle's hospitality instead of the other way round, would he have been equally a pain in the neck?
Well, I'm sure he would. Just like de Gaulle, Churchill would have insisted on the dignity of his country. And de Gaulle, I think, understood Churchill in a way that no other leader did. I remain struck by the tribute that de Gaulle paid to Churchill in his own war memoirs. He wrote, "Winston Churchill appeared to me from one end of the drama to the other as the great champion of a great enterprise and the great artist of a great history." I think those words are worth unpacking. De Gaulle had a huge admiration for Churchill's leadership, his championing of Britain, his commitment to the cause, and of course his support for France at a time when most people had written off the French. But de Gaulle also understood how deeds and words were so fundamental to Churchill, because he too is a man who understood the importance of writing himself into history, and he spent a long time writing his own memoirs in the 1950s. The other phrase that I think is important, is in a way even more important, is great artist of a great history. De Gaulle's capturing there the sense that Churchill is someone who's not just a wordsmith, but a painter, who has the ability to use words, if you like, to bring to life vividly the tapestry of Britain's long story. And of course, that's what Churchill did in his final years. He published a history of the English-speaking peoples across the world. Now, de Gaulle has a similar sense of himself as the incarnation of France, and how he embodies, if you like, a grand narrative that stretches back over the centuries to Clemenceau in the First World War, Napoleon, Joan of Arc, to Charlemagne. So here are two men who each could be spoken of as a great artist of a great history. And despite all the rows they had, each of them knows this fundamentally in his heart.
Thank you, David. This is the last episode of Creating Churchill. Do continue to listen, rate and review our show. It really helps attract more listeners. And if you'd like to read more about Churchill, David's book, Mirrors of Greatness, Churchill and the Leaders Who Shaped Him, is out now in paperback, published by William Collins in the UK and Basic Books in the US. We hope to be back with a new series of history discussions and a new subject in the new year. So watch this space and follow our podcast at creating_hist on X, TikTok and Instagram. You've been listening to David Reynolds and Russell Barnes in Creating Churchill. Creating Churchill features music by Rich Farnsworth, digital marketing by Lee Mann, and sound engineering by Andrew Chappell. Creating Churchill is a Clear Story, Creating History production.